Hello and welcome to this Foster Care Institute online training webinar, Compassion Fatigue and Burnout. I'm your host, Dr. John DeGarmo, founder and director of the Foster Care Institute. I'm an international speaker and trainer. I'm a consultant for foster care agencies. I'm an author of several foster care books, and I have been a foster parent myself to over 60 plus children who have come through my home and joined my family. Our goal during this webinar is to increase your awareness of compassion fatigue and burnout among those staff members and caseworkers who work with youth in foster care. Our key objectives are to increase your awareness of compassion fatigue and how it impacts your life, and to gain an understanding of how to develop and implement strategies designed to aid with both compassion fatigue and burnout. Now, as we have seen here at the Foster Care Institute, and as you most likely know, when youth are placed in foster care, it is a time of tremendous stress and anxiety. I would like you to imagine a teenager taken from his home, taken from his family suddenly, many times without real explanation that he might understand, taken from his school, taken from all that he knows and everything that is familiar to him, and placed into a therapeutical or residential setting, a group home, if you will. Well, for many youth, it is a time of uncertainty, a time of confusion, a time of sadness, a time of depression, a time of despair. Perhaps some youth might feel guilty. They may feel that they did something wrong. They may feel it's their fault. Perhaps their parents are incarcerated. The teens might feel it's their fault. Perhaps the parents are hospitalized. The teens may feel it's their fault. Perhaps the teens have been abandoned by their family. Again, the teens might feel it's their fault. So there might be a time of great guilt as well. And for some teens, they might be unable to express fully and completely how they feel. They may not have the words, or perhaps they are overwhelmed with some of the feelings and they're unable to properly process them. Now, as staff, when you're caring for youth in foster care, when you're working alongside youth who are in crisis, youth who have experienced great trauma, youth who are placed in a home, well, you invest a great deal of your time. As you know, it's really not, truly not, a 9 to 5 type of job. You invest much of your time. You invest yourself emotionally. If you are like me, when I hear the story of why youth are placed into a foster care home like my own, well, I feel for them. I take those feelings on board myself. I invest myself emotionally, and I imagine that you do the same. That's why you went into this type of career. You want to help youth who are suffering. You want to make a difference in the life of youth who are in crisis. You want to help those youth who truly are suffering. So you invest yourself emotionally. And working with these type of youth is an exhausting job. You invest yourself physically. Indeed, you invest much of your life because it's a different type of lifestyle when you are working with youth who are suffering and youth who are in crisis and youth who are placed into the home or the therapeutical residential setting. Well, it's not a normal type of a job. It's a different kind of lifestyle. What you are doing is something that your friends, your family members, those closest to you, they truly do not understand. They don't understand your type of job, if you will. They don't understand your type of career. They don't understand this type of lifestyle. The truth is this: today's staff, people like you who are working with youth in crisis, well, you are overworked, overwhelmed, under resourced, under supported. The residential homes are often understaffed and underpaid. To be sure, this very well is going to be the hardest job you will ever have. Again, your friends and family members, and perhaps even your own spouse or partner, might not understand what it's like working with youth in crisis. All the demands, the exhaustion that goes along with it. It could be the hardest job you will ever have. Feelings of burnout and stress are normal. When you are feeling burned out, when you're feeling a little bit stressed, or maybe even a great deal of stress at work, this is normal. Remember, you are not in charge of a situation. You are not often in control of how the children might act or react towards you or behave. It's also important to remember this: sometimes the youth are removed from their homes and placed into your setting. It's a decision made by the courts. Again, it's something that you do not have control of. Thus, when the youth come to live at the home, and they might be acting out, behaving out, or questioning why they're living at the home, again, this is not a decision that you have made, and you have no control over it. Now let's look at burnout. Burnout is a slow growing condition that derives from stress and poor stress management. Perhaps you're feeling stressed today. Perhaps you've been experiencing stress recently. If it's something that's been happening over a slow period of time and continues to grow and grow and grow, you might experience burnout. It happens over a long period of time, this slow growing condition. And it's both a physical and mental exhaustion. Let me ask you this: do you feel exhausted right now? Do you feel mentally exhausted at work? Do you sometimes feel that you're just so tired you can't go on? Do you have that physical exhaustion as well? If so, it's likely that you are experiencing burnout. Now, burnout will increase if you have less support than you need, if you have less resources than you need. If you are a workaholic, if you will, or a perfectionist, then burnout can increase. Because when you're working with youth in crisis, there is no possible way that you can truly be a perfectionist. Many times, as burnout increases, you might feel powerless. And burnout can increase when you're nurturing and looking after others in need. And this is your job. You are nurturing and looking after youth in need. They need you to help them, to care for them, to nurture them, and to love them. And when you're doing this day after day after day for youth who are in crisis, well, burnout can happen. So, what are the stages of burnout? Well, there's exhaustion. Perhaps you feel very, very tired. Your own behavior can be affected. Perhaps you feel anger or resentment. Perhaps there's anger or resentment at the youth that you're working with. Maybe anger or resentment at other staff members. Perhaps you have anger or resentment towards the supervisor. Maybe you feel anger or resentment towards the birth parents or biological family members of the youth that you're working with. Indeed, you might feel anger or resentment towards the foster care system in general. Again, this is normal. As burnout increases, you might feel tremendous sadness or maybe apathy. Now, when you are in the midst of burnout, you might deny it. You might deny that you are indeed burned out. And in fact, you might double your work efforts. I recall a time myself when I had 11 children placed in my home. It was my wife and I with 11 children. We had no help, no outside help. And in addition, we had two both full-time jobs. Both of us were working full-time. And I was, as you can imagine, with 11 children in the home, I was burned out. I was truly burned out. I woke up in the mornings feeling completely exhausted. My behavior was affected. I did have resentment. I also had a great deal of sadness. At the same time, I denied that I was burned out. I denied those feelings. And I doubled my work effort. I dug down and tried to work harder. Was it healthy? No, it was not. Now, your job is very stressful, to be sure. Each child, each youth, each teenager that is placed in the home, well, each one is different. Each one is unique. And as each child is placed in the home, that means their differences are going to be difficult to get used to the job, if you will. It's never going to be the same thing day in and day out, as you well know. And as each youth come to the home with their own differences, it means you have to adjust to the new challenges that these youth bring. Because each child, each youth is going to bring a set of new challenges that are different and unique to them. So once again, it's really truly impossible to get used to the job because it's going to be a different experience with every single child each day. We hear a lot about compassion fatigue. We looked at burnout, but what is compassion fatigue? Well, according to Dr. Charles Figley, compassion fatigue is this: the natural consequence behaviors resulting from knowledge about a traumatizing event experienced by significant others. It is the stress resulting from helping or wanting to help a traumatized or suffering person. Again, thank you for Dr. Charles Figley for this quote. Now, let's look at this here. You are working with traumatized or suffering people. You are most likely going to experience some sort of stress from trying to help the youth in crisis at the home. Secondary traumatic stress is another word for compassion fatigue. Secondary traumatic stress, we're going to refer to it as STS. So compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress are basically the same thing. So why might you experience secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue? Well, as caretakers and staff, we're likely to experience emotional and physical responses to the number, differences, a variety of stresses and anxieties that crop up, if you will, when we care for those youth who have suffered from abuse, from those youth who have experienced neglect, from those youth who have been traumatized. Again, we as staff members are likely to experience emotional or physical responses to the number of different stresses and anxieties when we care for these youth who have experienced both abuse, neglect, as well as trauma. Now, caretakers and staff are at great risk of secondary traumatic stress when you work with children and youth who have suffered from, and when you live with these youth on an ongoing basis. When you're working with them day after day after day, youth who have experienced trauma, youth who are filled with anxiety, youth who are, again, in crisis, when you're working with them over and over and over on an ongoing basis, you are at risk of secondary traumatic stress. Let's look at what Dr. Riemann says. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. I love this quote. Let's look at it one more time. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. So, what causes secondary traumatic stress? What are the causes of compassion fatigue? To begin them with, there's empathy. When you're working with youth, if you are like me, you feel their pain. You feel their suffering. People often ask me, why did I become a foster parent? Well, I dive into it greatly in my book, Fostering Love, One Foster Parent's Journey. But very basically, I became a foster parent after the death of my first child. I wanted to help others. And then when I get those phone calls for children and youth to come to my home and I hear their story, I hear how they've suffered, I feel that. I feel it in my heart. I take it on my own shoulders and in my heart. And perhaps you do as well. You empathize. Perhaps you even over empathize or over identify with a teen and their suffering. When you do this, it places yourself at risk of internalizing their pain and internalizing their trauma. My friend, this is what happens to me. I internalize their pain, I internalize their trauma. When you experience your own traumatic event or suffer personal loss, well, your own feelings can be triggered as you care for children with similar experiences. And it gives you a risk, it makes you a risk of internalizing the trauma of the child. Let me tell you about Julie. When Julie was a child, Julie was raped over and over again by her cousin. Her family knew about it. They did not want to cause additional stress among the family, so they ignored it, if you will. They brushed it under the carpet, if you will, and pretended that it really did not happen. They didn't address it. As a result, Julie never got the professional help, the therapy, the counseling sessions that she needed. Julie later on got married and became a foster parent. One placement was of a teenage girl who had also been raped. When Julie found out about this, Julie tried to help the teenage girl who had been raped. During this time, Julie's own past trauma resurfaced. And Julie was also dealing with not only the teenager's anxiety and experiences of rape, she was now truly dealing with, perhaps for the first time in her life, dealing with her past trauma, her own experiences of rape, because it was so similar to the youth placed in the home. This can happen with compassion fatigue. If you have experienced something similar to the children and the youth that you're working with, well, then your own pain, your own trauma, your own anxiety can resurface, and this can lead to secondary traumatic stress. Lack of recovery time is also another cause for compassion fatigue. As one teenager leaves the home that you're working with and another soon arrives, many times we do not allow ourselves time to grieve, time to heal, time for some time off from such an emotionally demanding lifestyle. Because it is a lifestyle. I don't consider what you're doing a job. It's a different kind of lifestyle because you're immersing all of yourself into this job, if you will. You're giving all of your heart, all of your emotions, all of your time. And when we do this, when we become attached to some teenagers, when we have this type of bond or relationship with them, when we form that type of unconditional love, and they might leave to age out, to transition out, to perhaps be adopted, whatever it might be. But when they leave the residential home and you form that deep, deep, deep relationship with them, well, you might not allow yourself time to grieve. You might not allow yourself time to heal from that broken heart. This can lead to secondary traumatic stress. So, what are the symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, as well as burnout? They're both very similar. Anger, perhaps you may feel with anger. You might experience anxiety, perhaps deep sadness, prolonged grief. You might become cynical of the system. You might become irritable. Perhaps you're experiencing mood swings. Maybe you're self isolating. Maybe you just wish when you go home from work, you might simply just shut the world off, so to speak, and stay by yourself. Other symptoms include minor health complaints, tiredness or weariness, too little sleep, or maybe even too much sleep. Perhaps your appetite is changing. These are symptoms of burnout as well as secondary traumatic stress. Yet there are more symptoms, and let's look at those. You might question, quite simply, the meaning of life. With all this suffering, all these teenagers and youth who have experienced tremendous, horrific trauma, who are filled with deep anxiety, who are suffering, you might question why. Why? Perhaps you feel a loss of purpose in life. Maybe there's a lack of self satisfaction. Maybe you even question your own religious beliefs. And that's quite common. For those who are working day in and day out with youth who have suffered immensely and are filled with pain and anxiety, who have experienced horrific abuse, neglect, been abandoned, and you're working with them day in, day out, you might question your religious beliefs. So, how do we treat compassion fatigue as well as burnout? They're both very similar, okay? How do we treat it? Well, it's so important that we take time for ourselves. You need to look after you. Now, if you do not take care of you, then you cannot take care of youth in crisis. If you don't care for yourself, then you can't care for these youth who need you. There's something that's very special about you. There's something that's very unique about you. Don't neglect what that is. Don't neglect what makes you you. You need to take time for yourself. That might be in hobbies or interests. For myself, I love to garden. It's a hobby of mine, if you will. I love to garden. I also love music. So when I am feeling some stress or anxiety or compassion fatigue, and I have experienced it as a foster parent of 60 plus kids, I have experienced compassion fatigue. It's quite normal. It's quite normal. I I go to my garden. I find peace and solitude there. I sing often in the car. Reading, spending some time reading, spending some time with friends is a great way to treat burnout and compassion fatigue. Perhaps going shopping with friends, or to the movies, or dinner, or inviting some friends over. Some personal quiet time is very important when you're trying to treat both burnout, stress, and compassion fatigue. Spending some time quietly by yourself, perhaps in devotion, perhaps in meditation, perhaps in prayer, perhaps walking around the neighborhood quietly by yourself, perhaps it's working in the garden quietly. One way to treat compassion fatigue and burnout and stress is learning to say no. Now, this can be difficult. When you're working with youth in crisis, you want to try to help them as best you can, but sometimes you might need to say, no, I can't do that. When all those yeses build up, remember, burnout happens over a period of time, and it's a slow growing condition. So if you're saying yes, 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 yes to everything, because you want to be the best that you can be, sometimes you need to learn to say, no, I just can't do that right now. I need a little bit of time by myself. I need to step back and focus on me. I need to care for myself. So don't think of saying no as saying no to the child. Think of it as saying yes to yourself so you can better care for that child. Remember what I said earlier. If you can't care for yourself, you cannot care for the youth. And caring for yourself means sometimes saying no. I understand. I understand that can be difficult, and it's difficult for me. I have a hard time saying no, but I recognize this. Sometimes I need to say no so I can say yes later on to other opportunities in a healthy fashion. Another way to treat compassion fatigue and burnout stress is staying focused on the here and staying focused on the now. Do not think about all the possibilities of the future. Do not think about all the worries of tomorrow. Or do not worry about things that are completely out of your control. Quite simply, do not allow worries to overwhelm you because that leads to burnout, stress, compassion fatigue. Instead, focus on today. Focus on the things that you can control. Focus on what's happening in the here and now. Many people may say this to you. I couldn't do your job. It would hurt too much working with those youth. Well, that's quite true. It can be an emotionally exhausting and heartbreaking job at times. My friend, it's okay to let your heart break. It's okay to allow yourself to become emotionally invested. Indeed, it is healthy. It is healthy to become emotionally invested in the teens because it allows us to truly help them grow. It allows us to help these youth in crisis to heal from their pain when we become emotionally invested. Quite simply, and you know this to be true, the teenagers that you're working with will truly know what staff members care and what staff members do not care. Exercise, sleep, diet, these are all three very, very important ways to help yourself when you're experiencing burnout, when you are filled with stress, when you have secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. Exercise allows us to have our endorphins to be released, which helps us to feel great. It revitalizes our well being. When we focus on eating healthy diets, well, this gives us the right energy that we need, which helps to prevent burnout. And of course, a good night's sleep helps health, helps well being, and productivity. So do not skimp on any of these. Get the exercise that you need, eat healthy, and get that good night's sleep. Again, these all combine to combat compassion fatigue and burnout and stress. Perhaps you've heard the saying, patience is a virtue. It's true. Try not to lose control over the situation you're in. Remain in control. Remain patient. If that teenager is yelling at you, cursing at you, refusing to obey the expectations and the rules of the house, do not yell at them in kind. Instead, respond in a calm fashion. Respond with compassion. Do not lose control when they have lost control. Now, if you struggle with patience, call a timeout. Step away. Count to 10. This will help to de escalate the situation. Indeed, there might be times when you might have to ask another staff member, or perhaps your supervisor, to step in for a moment or two while you take a timeout. And that's okay. When you take that timeout, it does not mean that you're a failure as a staff member. It means the opposite. It means what you're doing is you're helping yourself and the teen during what could be a difficult situation. So again, it's okay to step away, to count to 10, maybe 20. This again helps to de-escalate the situation. So ask that staff member, ask that supervisor, if you will, for help. Just say, quite simply, I need to step away for a minute. I need to have a little bit of a breather. I'm becoming a little bit overheated here. Because this is a stressful situation, and I just need to take a little bit of a time out. Can you please cover for me? When that teenager is yelling at you, when they're calling you every name in the book, and I've been called those names too. When they're refusing to do what you've asked them to do not take it personally. It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with the teen. Remind yourself, the teenager's not attacking you personally. Most likely, they're afraid. Most likely, they're concerned or hurting when they're yelling at you, when they're refusing to do what you ask them to do. Most likely, they're feeling some type of emotional pain. It has nothing to do with you. So instead, focus on the behavior, respond to why the person is feeling this way. So if that teen is having a difficult time with you, if they're refusing to listen to you, if they're standing in the hall yelling at you, if they're simply refusing to go along with the house rules, try to figure out why. Why are they acting this way? And then respond in kind. All right? Ask yourself, are they yelling at me because they're afraid or concerned? Perhaps they're filled with anger that they can't control. When you do these things, when you don't take it personally, this helps with compassion fatigue. There are so many resources today about helping combat burnout and stress, combating compassion fatigue. Indeed, I dive into it into the book, The Foster Care Survival Guide. You can find many resources online. You can find a lot of great help online. So if you're struggling with compassion fatigue, if you're feeling burned out and stressed, perhaps you should take a few moments and just look online for some help. Finally, you need to have a support group of some kind. You need to surround yourself with people who understand exactly what you're going through. If you are feeling burned out, if you're feeling stressed, if you think that you might be experiencing compassion fatigue at this time, talk to your supervisor. Talk to a therapist or counselor. Talk to your fellow staff members. Surround yourself with people who understand what you're going through and can help you. We all need a support group of some kind. So find your support group. Perhaps it's at work. Perhaps it's at a faith-based organization or a church. Perhaps it isn't within your home and your family. Do not do this by yourself. Take care of yourself. And part of taking care of yourself is surrounding yourself with people who can help you, who can lift you up during those difficult times, who will not be critical of you, who will not judge you, but will instead support you. My friend, you have a difficult job. Burnout, stress, and compassion fatigue are very, very normal conditions when you work daily with youth in crisis. It's important that you recognize when you're experiencing these things and how to address it. I'll say it one more time. If you can't care for yourself, you cannot care for these children and these youth who need you. For much more, visit the website, the Foster Care Institute, at drjohndegarmofostercare.com. Follow me on Facebook if you haven't already, at Dr. John DeGarmo Foster Care Institute. Follow me on Twitter. If you have questions about this webinar or anything else that I can help you with, I'm here to help. Email me, please, at drjohndegarmo@gmail.com. I mentioned earlier the book, The Foster Care Survival Guide, the essential guide for today's foster care parents. This is a great book for you as well. Great book for you as well. It dives deep into how you can help yourself when you're experiencing burnout and stress and compassion fatigue, and so much more. We have this book and so many other great books at the Foster Care Institute. Happy to send you a personally signed copy when you order it. Again, your job is a challenging, difficult one that so few will understand. Quite frankly, your friends and family members and those closest to you truly do not understand what it is like working with children and youth in crisis. And they do not understand the toll it can take on somebody emotionally, somebody physically. I understand. I understand what it's like. I understand how difficult your job is. I understand how exhausting it can be. I also understand the rewards that go along with it. You are making a difference. You are changing the world of a youth, of a teenager who desperately needs someone to care. So, for that, I want to thank you. Thank you for taking time to watch this webinar. Thank you for taking time for caring for youth in crisis. For the Foster Care Institute, I'm Dr. John DeGarmo.